Mark Carter didn't just let his mistress humiliate his pregnant wife at the Christmas party he'd been planning for weeks. He handed her the microphone. While Evelyn stood in the back corner of the ballroom, one hand resting protectively on her barely showing belly, the other gripping her 6-year-old twins close to her legs, her husband stood at the center of everything, laughing. The woman beside him, Sienna Blake, beautiful, polished, confident, wasn't wearing a wedding ring. But she was wearing Mark's attention like a crown. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. Mark had told Evelyn it was a company Christmas party, important clients, his chance to finally prove himself. He'd told her to wear something nice, but not too much. He'd told her the twins could come for an hour, then they'd leave quietly. He didn't tell her that Sienna would be seated beside him at the head table, while Evelyn was placed with strangers in the overflow section. He didn't tell her that when the photographer called for the leadership photo, she'd be asked to step aside. He didn't tell her that his mistress would toast to their partnership in front of 50 guests and call Evelyn, loud enough for the room to hear, the kind of woman born for the background. What Mark didn't know, what no one in that room knew except the silver-haired lawyer watching silently from table 9, was that Evelyn Carter was not just a quiet housewife in a simple green dress holding her children's hands too tightly. She was the daughter of William Hayes, a man the world had known as a modest estate attorney. But William Hayes had died 3 weeks ago, and the lawyers settling his affairs had discovered something that would rewrite the meaning of wealth itself. The man had secretly controlled $2.3 trillion, not millions, not billions, trillions, and every cent of it, every shell corporation, every foundation, every silent stake in companies that shaped governments now belonged to the pregnant woman standing in the back of the room, watching her husband thank another woman for her partnership. The guest list Mark had approved without reading it carefully, the one Sienna had organized so proudly, wasn't just random executives and holiday well-wishers. It was a carefully curated assembly of senators, CEOs, hospital directors, and power brokers, all of whom had one thing in common. They answered to William Hayes, and now they answered to his daughter. The same daughter whose husband was at that very moment letting his mistress suggest the twins be moved to a side room because children didn't belong at adult tables. Mark saw the guest list at 6:23 p.m., 37 minutes before the humiliation would peak. He saw names that made his throat tighten: Margaret DuPont, the investor he'd been chasing for 8 months, Senator Patricia Morrison, Richard Thornwell, Sienna's CEO, the man Mark desperately wanted to impress. And then he saw the name at the bottom, the event coordinator, Hayes Foundation. His face went pale, but he didn't connect it. Not yet. He didn't know that Hayes was Evelyn's father's name. He didn't know that the foundation coordinating his career-making Christmas party was the same one that had sent his wife certified letters he'd hidden from her. He didn't know that in less than 2 hours, a lawyer would stand up, call for silence, and explain to everyone in that room exactly who Evelyn Carter really was. But Evelyn knew. At 7:51 p.m., standing near the registration table with Noah pressed against her side and Lily holding her hand, she picked up the guest list to distract herself from the pain of watching Sienna's hand rest on her husband's shoulder. And she saw it. The watermark, the Hayes Foundation seal, the same symbol from the letters her mother had locked away, the same one on the business card she'd been too afraid to call back. Her heart didn't break in that moment. It crystallized, because as she read down the list of names, powerful names, names that made senators, names that moved markets, she realized something that turned her humiliation into something far more dangerous. These people weren't here for Mark. They were here for her. Her father had died, but he'd left her something more valuable than money. He'd left her a room full of people who had no idea they were watching the wrong person. The twins felt their mother's hand tighten. Noah looked up at her, his eyes worried, the same eyes that had watched his father ignore him all night. Evelyn looked down at her son and did something she hadn't done in years. She smiled. Not the tired, apologetic smile she'd been wearing like armor, a different smile, the kind that comes when you realize the game just changed and no one else knows it yet. What happens when a man lets his mistress humiliate his pregnant wife and their twins at a Christmas party, not knowing his wife is the daughter of a secret trillionaire who died recently, and everyone in the room, every single person he's trying to impress, is actually there to meet her? What happens when the guest list he barely glanced at is actually a list of people who control his career, his reputation, and his future, and every one of them is about to find out what he let happen to the woman they've been instructed to protect? And what happens when his pregnant wife, standing in the back of the room with her children and her mother's necklace and a belly full of a baby he doesn't even know exists, stops shaking and starts calculating? Evelyn had learned to be invisible long before she married Mark Carter. Her mother, Catherine, had taught her that survival sometimes meant taking up less space, speaking softer, asking for nothing. Catherine had raised her alone in a small apartment that always smelled like lavender soap and yesterday's coffee, working double shifts as a legal secretary, never complaining, never explaining why Evelyn's father wasn't there. Once a year, a cream-colored envelope arrived with no return address. Catherine would take it quietly, tuck it away, and the rent would be paid that month. Evelyn learned not to ask questions. She learned that some absences were louder than presence, and some secrets were kept because love demanded it. The only thing her mother ever said about her father was this: "If your father loved you, he did it from far away." Evelyn didn't understand what that meant until her high school graduation, when she saw a man standing across the street in an expensive suit that didn't match the neighborhood. He didn't wave. He didn't approach. He just stood there watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Or grief so old it had fossilized into something harder. Her mother had stiffened beside her, hand tightening on Evelyn's shoulder. "Come on, they're calling your name for photos." When Evelyn looked back, the man was gone. She never saw him again. Not at her college graduation, not at her wedding, not when the twins were born. Just silence, year after year, like a door that wouldn't open no matter how many times she stood in front of it. Her mother died 14 months ago, suddenly. A stroke in the middle of folding laundry. Evelyn found her on the kitchen floor with a dishcloth still in her hand and the radio playing softly in the background. In the weeks that followed, while sorting through her mother's things, Evelyn found a locked metal box under the bed. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, unopened envelopes addressed to Catherine in careful handwriting, postmarked from different cities, different countries, spanning 32 years, and at the bottom, a single photograph. A young man and her mother, laughing on a park bench, his hand resting on her stomach. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Before everything changed." Evelyn had stared at that photo for an hour, trying to reconcile the smiling man with the absence that had shaped her entire life. She didn't open the letters. She couldn't. It felt like trespassing on her mother's grief. She put the box back under the bed and told herself she'd deal with it later. Later became weeks. Weeks became months. And then 3 weeks ago, the voicemail came. "Miss Evelyn Carter, this is Daniel Rowe, attorney at law. I'm calling regarding a confidential estate matter. I believe I represent someone connected to you. It's urgent we speak." She deleted it. The next day, a certified letter arrived. Mark got the mail first. He never mentioned it. She found out later he'd hidden it in his office drawer, unopened, because it had come from a law firm he didn't recognize, and he didn't want her distracted. 2 days before the Christmas party, the third attempt came. A business card slipped under her apartment door while she was putting the twins to bed. On the front, embossed in gold, Hayes Foundation, Daniel Rowe, executor of estate. On the back, handwritten, "Your father wanted you to know he never stopped watching." Evelyn's hands had trembled so badly she dropped the card. She picked it up, read it again, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not anger, not even sadness. Just a vast, aching question she'd carried her entire life finally being answered. "He knew about me. He watched. He chose distance anyway." She didn't call. She told herself she would, after the party, after Mark's big night, after things settled. She didn't know she was 8 weeks pregnant yet. She didn't know her body was growing a third child while her marriage was quietly dying. She didn't know that in 72 hours she'd be standing in a ballroom full of strangers watching her husband laugh with a woman who looked at Evelyn like she was wallpaper. All she knew was that the necklace around her neck, the one her mother never took off, the one Evelyn had inherited and worn every day since, suddenly felt heavier, like it was trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Mark had been different once. She remembered their third date, how he'd looked at her across a small cafe table and said, "You don't argue. You listen. Most women I meet just want to talk at me. You actually hear me." She'd smiled, flattered, thinking listening was love, thinking his need for her quietness was the same as valuing her. He'd been charming then, ambitious in a way that felt exciting instead of desperate. He talked about building something, about never being small again, about proving to everyone who'd underestimated him that he mattered. Evelyn admired that drive. She didn't see the warning signs, that his ambition had teeth, that his need to matter was slowly erasing everyone around him. When the twins were born, Noah first, then Lily 3 minutes later, Evelyn had been offered a promotion at the nonprofit where she worked. Regional coordinator. It would have meant travel, visibility, her own budget, her own voice. She'd been excited, terrified, hopeful. She told Mark over dinner. He'd paused, fork halfway to his mouth, and said, "Do you really think that's fair to them?" She'd looked at the twins sleeping in their bassinets by the window. Mark continued, "They need stability, a mom who's present, not someone chasing a career at the expense of her family." She'd declined the job the next day. Mark never asked what she gave up. He assumed she hadn't lost anything important. Over time, his gratitude for her quietness turned into expectation. Her support became invisible, and Evelyn became the kind of woman people looked past without thinking twice. But tonight, standing in this ballroom with her children pressed against her legs and a guest list in her hands that was rewriting everything she thought she knew about her life, Evelyn felt something shift. The man who'd abandoned her hadn't forgotten her. He'd built an empire in the shadows and left every piece of it in her name. And the people who mattered, the people Mark was performing for, desperate to impress, were already hers. She folded the guest list carefully, slipped it into her purse, and looked across the room at her husband. He was laughing at something Sienna said, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. He looked so confident, so sure of himself. He had no idea the floor was about to fall out from under him. Evelyn knelt down slowly, careful of the nausea still rolling through her stomach, and looked her twins in the eyes. Noah's face was tight with worry. Lily was trying to be brave. Evelyn touched both their cheeks gently and whispered, "I need you to trust me. Stay close, stay quiet, and watch Mommy, okay? No matter what happens, we're going to be fine." Noah nodded, his small hand gripping hers tighter. Lily whispered back, "Is Daddy okay?" Evelyn's throat closed. She kissed Lily's forehead and said softly, "Daddy's about to learn something very important." She stood, straightened her simple green dress, the only one that fit her changing body, and touched the gold necklace at her throat. Then she turned toward table 9, where the silver-haired man had been watching her all night, and walked slowly toward him. Every step felt like a choice. Every breath felt like a beginning. Daniel Rose stood when he saw Evelyn walking toward him. He was in his mid-60s, silver hair combed perfectly, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars but somehow didn't look flashy. His eyes were kind but sharp, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. When Evelyn reached his table, slightly out of breath, her children flanking her like small sentinels, he extended his hand slowly, carefully, as if he understood she might bolt. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "I'm Daniel Rowe. I've been trying to reach you." Evelyn's voice came out steadier than she expected. "I know who you are. I saw your card." Daniel glanced at the twins, then back at Evelyn. His expression softened. "May I speak frankly?" She nodded. "Your father, William Hayes, passed away 3 weeks ago. He left specific instructions that you be informed immediately, but also that you be protected during the transition. He knew this would be overwhelming. He knew you didn't grow up with wealth or power or any of the things he controlled. He wanted to give you time. But tonight," he gestured subtly toward the room, "tonight was always going to be the night you learned the truth." Evelyn felt her knees weaken. She sat down heavily in the chair beside him. The twins pressed closer. "Why tonight?" she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Because everyone who matters in your father's world is in this room. Senators, CEOs, foundation board members, people who've spent decades taking orders from William Hayes without ever meeting him face to face. He operated in complete secrecy to keep you safe. But now that he's gone, the empire needs a visible heir. You. And your father wanted these people to see you before the lawyers made it official. He wanted them to witness who you are, not just what you've inherited." Evelyn's mind was spinning. She looked across the room at Mark, still laughing with Sienna, oblivious. Her voice cracked. "My husband doesn't know." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm aware. Your father knew about Mark too. He had him investigated 2 years ago when the marriage started to show cracks. William didn't intervene because he believed you needed to make your own choices, but he made sure that when the time came, you'd have every advantage." He looked at her meaningfully. "Mrs. Carter, do you understand what I'm telling you? The people your husband is trying to impress tonight, the investors, the power brokers, they all work for you now. They just don't know it yet." The words hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Evelyn stared at Daniel, then at the guest list still clutched in her hand. Margaret DuPont, Senator Morrison, Richard Thornwell, all of them. She looked at Noah and Lily, their wide eyes watching her, trusting her, waiting for her to tell them what came next. And then she looked at Mark, still performing, still pretending, still convinced he was the center of everything. At 7:28 p.m., it had started. Sienna had turned to a passing waiter and said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "The children shouldn't be at the adult tables. Perhaps there's a side room?" Noah had looked up at his father, hopeful, waiting for him to say something, anything. Mark had glanced at his son, then at Sienna, and said flatly, "Noah, listen to Ms. Blake." The waiter had hesitated, uncomfortable. Evelyn had felt Noah's hand go rigid in hers. She had opened her mouth to speak, to defend her child, but the words had died in her throat. She'd been silent so long, she didn't remember how to be loud. At 7:34 p.m., Sienna had laughed at something one of the executives said and added, gesturing vaguely toward Evelyn's section, "Some women are just born for the background, aren't they? It's not bad. Someone has to hold the coats." 3 women at the table had laughed. One had glanced at Evelyn with something close to pity. Evelyn had felt her face burn, felt her hands shake so badly she had to set down her water glass. She'd looked at Mark, silently begging him to see her, to defend her, to remember that she was his wife. He'd been staring at his phone. At 7:41 p.m., the photographer had called for a leadership photo. Mark had stood immediately, straightening his tie, eager. Sienna had slipped beside him, her hand resting on his arm like she belonged there. The photographer had looked at Evelyn standing awkwardly nearby and said politely, "Mrs. Carter, you can step aside. This is just the executive team." Mark hadn't corrected him, hadn't even looked at her. He'd posed with Sienna, smiling wide, while Evelyn stood 5 feet away holding her children's hands, invisible. At 7:47 p.m., Mark had given a toast. He'd thanked his team, named 7 colleagues, praised the sponsors, and called Sienna his invaluable partner in making tonight possible. The word partner had echoed. Someone at table 3 had whispered to their companion, "Are they together?" The companion had shrugged. Evelyn had felt something inside her chest crack so deeply she thought she might shatter right there in front of everyone, but she hadn't shattered. Because at 7:51 p.m. she'd picked up the guest list, and everything had changed. Now it was 8:32 p.m. Daniel was still watching her, waiting. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "in 13 minutes, I'm going to stand up and make an announcement. Your father's will requires it. Every person in this room is going to learn that you are the sole heir to the Hayes estate. Your husband will learn it. His mistress will learn it. And every single person he's been trying to impress will learn it. The question is, what do you want to happen after that?" Evelyn's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from rage, from clarity. From 32 years of being unseen, unheard, and underestimated, finally reaching a breaking point. She looked Daniel in the eye and said, her voice low and dangerous, "I want the truth. All of it. I want to know what my father built. I want to know why he left. And I want everyone in this room to see exactly what my husband let happen tonight before they find out who I really am." Daniel smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who'd been waiting for his client to finally get angry. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were documents, photographs, letters. "Your father wrote you a letter," he said quietly, sliding it across the table. "He wanted you to read it before the announcement. It explains everything. Why he left, why he stayed away, why he never stopped protecting you." Evelyn's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. She opened it slowly. "My dearest Evelyn," it began. "If you're reading this, I am gone, and you are finally safe enough to know the truth. I loved your mother more than life itself, but the world I operated in was built on violence, secrecy, and power that would have destroyed her and you if anyone knew you existed. I left to protect you. I watched from a distance, every birthday, every graduation, every moment I could without putting you in danger. I built an empire so that one day you would never be powerless. I built it so you would never have to beg, never have to shrink, never have to accept cruelty from anyone. You are my daughter. You are stronger than you know. And now everything I built is yours. Use it wisely, use it fiercely, and never let anyone make you small again. With all my love, your father." Evelyn read it twice, then a third time. Tears blurred the words, but she didn't wipe them away. Noah reached up and touched her arm. "Mommy?" She looked down at him, this beautiful, worried little boy who'd watched his father dismiss him tonight, and something inside her hardened into steel. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then she looked at Daniel and said, "Make the announcement." At 8:45 p.m., Daniel Rowe stood and walked to the front of the room. The music faded. Conversation stilled. Mark looked up, confused. Sienna frowned. Daniel tapped the microphone once, and the room fell completely silent. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and commanding. "My name is Daniel Rowe, executor of the estate of William Hayes. For those of you who don't know, William Hayes passed away 3 weeks ago. He spent his life building one of the most powerful financial empires in modern history, operating entirely in the shadows to protect the people he loved. Tonight, as per his final instructions, I'm here to introduce you to his sole heir." Mark's face went pale. Sienna's smile faltered. Daniel continued, "William Hayes controlled $2.3 trillion in assets across 847 corporations, foundations, and investment vehicles. He owned stakes in companies that employ millions. He funded hospitals, schools, and political campaigns. He shaped policy, moved markets, and built power structures that most people will never see. And he left everything, every single asset, every account, every share of stock, to his daughter." The room was so quiet you could hear breathing. Daniel turned and looked directly at Evelyn. "Mrs. Evelyn Carter, would you please stand?" Evelyn's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She stood slowly, her children rising with her. Every eye in the room turned toward the back corner where she'd been standing all night, invisible and forgotten. Daniel's voice rang out clear and final. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Evelyn Hayes Carter, daughter of William Hayes, and as of 3 weeks ago, the wealthiest woman you've never heard of. Everything you've been working for, everyone you've been answering to, every foundation grant, every corporate decision, every political endorsement, it all now runs through her." Mark's face drained of all color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sienna's hand dropped from his arm like she'd been burned. Margaret DuPont, the investor Mark had been desperately chasing, stood immediately and began walking toward Evelyn, her expression respectful, almost reverent. Senator Morrison followed. Then Richard Thornwell. Then a dozen others, all moving toward the woman in the simple green dress who'd been standing in the back all night holding her children's hands. Mark finally found his voice. He turned to Sienna, panic flickering in his eyes. "Did you know about this?" Sienna stared at him like he'd just told her the sky was falling. Her boss, Richard Thornwell, was now shaking Evelyn's hand and apologizing profusely for not recognizing her sooner. Sienna's career, her carefully constructed plan to seduce her way up the corporate ladder, had just imploded in real time. Evelyn stood perfectly still as the most powerful people in the room formed a line to meet her. Margaret DuPont reached her first. "Mrs. Carter, I had no idea. Your father and I worked together for 20 years, and I never knew he had a daughter. I'm so sorry for your loss. And I apologize if tonight was," she hesitated, uncomfortable. Evelyn looked her in the eye and said quietly, "It was more than uncomfortable. But I appreciate your honesty." Senator Morrison was next. She shook Evelyn's hand firmly. "Your father changed my life, funded my first campaign when no one else would. I'm at your service, Mrs. Carter, anything you need." One by one they came. CEOs, lawyers, hospital directors, people whose names carried weight in boardrooms and Senate chambers, and every single one of them had the same reaction when they realized what had happened. Horror, embarrassment, fury at Mark. Mark tried to approach. He pushed through the crowd, his face desperate. Evelyn, wait, I didn't know." She turned to face him. The room quieted again. He stopped 3 feet away, suddenly aware that everyone was watching. His voice dropped. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn's voice was calm, deadly calm. "You hid the lawyer's letters. You never asked where my mother's necklace came from. You never wondered why I didn't have baby photos or family stories. You never cared enough to ask, Mark, because I was useful, quiet. I was easier to control, invisible." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. You never said anything." Evelyn stepped closer. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut like glass. "I was standing 10 feet away when your mistress called me background decoration. You didn't stop her. I was holding our children when she suggested they be removed from the adult tables. You told our son to listen to her. You gave a toast thanking everyone but me. You posed for photos with her hand on your arm while I stood there invisible. And you want to talk about fair? The room was frozen. Noah's hand tightened in hers. Evelyn took a breath and said the words she'd been carrying for years. I'm pregnant, Mark. 8 weeks. You didn't notice because you stopped looking at me a long time ago. And now you're standing here, in a room full of people who control your entire career, realizing that the woman you treated like she didn't matter is the only reason any of them are here. Mark's face crumbled. Evelyn, please. Evelyn shook her head. She turned to Daniel. I want a divorce. I want full custody. And I want him out of my house by morning. Daniel nodded. Consider it done. Mark reached for her. Evelyn, don't do this. We can fix this. She looked at him one last time. The man she'd loved, the man she'd supported, the man who'd let another woman humiliate her in front of their children. No, she said simply. We can't. She took her twins' hands and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back one last time. The ballroom glittered with lights and power and people who now knew exactly who she was. Mark stood frozen in the center of it all, alone, surrounded by everyone he'd wanted to impress, all of them looking at him with something between disgust and pity. Sienna had already disappeared, and Evelyn, quiet, invisible Evelyn, walked out the door into the cold December night with her children and her future, and the weight of $2.3 trillion resting lightly on her shoulders, like it had always belonged there. 3 months later, Evelyn sat in her father's old office, now hers, reading through files and learning the language of power. Noah and Lily were in the next room doing homework. Her baby was growing steadily, safely. Mark had signed the divorce papers without a fight once his lawyer explained what fighting someone with unlimited resources looked like. Sienna had been fired within a week, and Evelyn had quietly begun reshaping her father's empire into something that protected women like her mother, like herself, women who'd been made invisible by men who should have seen them. She touched her mother's necklace and whispered, "Thank you. For teaching me to survive, for keeping his secret, for loving me enough to let him go." Then she picked up the phone and got back to work. Because the world didn't need another silent woman. It needed women who knew how to be quiet when it served them and how to be deafening when it mattered. And Evelyn Carter had just learned how to roar. Dear viewers, thank you for being here with Evelyn tonight. If you felt her pain, her strength, and her transformation, then you understand why this story matters. Stories like this don't just entertain. They remind us that invisible doesn't mean powerless, that quiet doesn't mean weak, and that sometimes the people who underestimate us are the ones who lose everything. If this story moved you, if you stood with Evelyn when Mark couldn't, then I need you to do something important right now. Subscribe to this channel. Don't just watch and walk away. Click that button and become part of a community that believes every person, especially every woman who's been made to feel small, deserves to be seen. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that might change how you see the world or yourself. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What part of Evelyn's story hit you the hardest? Was it the moment she realized the room was hers, the moment she told Mark about the baby, or the moment she walked out and never looked back? I want to hear from you, because your voice matters, your story matters. And this community is built on people who refuse to stay silent. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and let's keep telling stories about people who rise when the world tries to keep them down.